be destroyed, removed from political power, and the hostages returned. Now, Dave has said that's not necessary, and that all Israel needs to do is put more men on the wall. That's what Dave said his solution, because he also doesn't study military theory on how do you win a war. He intermixes counterinsurgency theory with a war against removing a regime from power, defeating their military.
This is
what
not what I was doing.
Factual. You said that was exact words on Lex Fridman.
No.
He's not making an appeal to facts. I'm debating. He's making an appeal to emotion and morals, not what the law.
Morals. I'm making an appeal to logic and morals.
Hamas started a war in October.
Dave Smith gets absolutely cooked here on Piers Morgan Uncensored by this Professor John Spencer. They were talking about the Douglas Murray debate that Dave Smith had on the Joe Rogan podcast, which I covered previously on my channel. They got into the topic of who's allowed to talk about, certain topics and whatnot. But then John Spencer started to actually lay in with a bunch of facts. And in my opinion, I think Dave Smith got cooked, showing that he's appealing on nothing more than emotion. But enough of my jibber jabber. Let's see how this debate between Dave Smith and John Spencer on the Piers Morgan Uncensored show goes down.
First of all, Dave Smith, are you surprised, Dave, about the reaction to your showdown with Douglas Murray? And do you believe you won?
I'm not surprised at all by the reaction. I was surprised by how the debate itself went. But as it was going that way, I knew exactly what the reaction was going to be. I thought that was pretty clear. I think that, I would say this, what I thought was kind of strange about it was, and I know probably both of you we could all think of examples like this. Like there's been many times where people were challenged to a debate and they refused to debate them. Dr. Hotez with Bobby Kennedy comes to mind for me, but there's lots of examples like this. And and sometimes that's reasonable and sometimes it's not reasonable. Like I think in the case of Hotez, he should have debated Bobby Kennedy. But at the same time, I've been challenged to debate flat earthers and people with 150 followers, and I'm not particularly interested in doing that. So sometimes you'll see people who go, they'll take the path of like, look, this person's beneath me. I'm not going to debate this issue. I have no interest in doing this. And then sometimes people will agree to debate. I think Douglas Murray is the first person I've ever seen try to do both. And it made for kind of an interesting spectacle. If you're asking me if I think I won, I mean, you can let other people can have their opinion on that. Obviously, I'm biased in saying that. I think that the overwhelming reaction that I've seen is much more that Douglas Murray lost than I won. I think I was there to debate Ukraine and Israel, and Douglas was there. He made it more of a bigger kind of watershed moment about the experts versus the podcasters, which was not what I thought we were going to do. But I think in doing that, it's hard to even say win or lose. You're going into an environment where you couldn't have worked harder to turn the entire audience against you. Obviously, by definition, the audience of the Joe Rogan Experience are on the side of the podcasters being allowed to talk about these issues. And as I said in the debate, I don't think the expert class has a very good track record.
Yeah, I said in my Douglas Murray Dave Smith video that whenever you start to just go after the, oh, well, are you even an expert? Do you even expert, bro? When you start to go in that direction, you lost. Like, you're showing that you lost. You're showing you have no good arguments. You have no rebuttals. So now you have to start attacking, you have to start using the ad hominem attacks and also the appeal to authority attacks. You have to resort to the ad hominems like, well, are you even an expert? Do you even know what you're talking about? You know, if you know better than Dave Smith, then show you know better. Make good arguments. Make good rebuttals. But if you can't do that, then yeah, I think you lost.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed it, for what it's worth. I've had you both on my show, of course, a lot, and I enjoy watching you go at each other. I've seen lots of praise for you, Dave, indisputably, a lot. I've also seen, and we've just got a little summary of some of the lack of praise for you. Dave Smith was eviscerated by Douglas Murray, posted Henry Hobson. This is what happens when bluster and shallow thinking go up against a considered intellect. John Daly said, watching someone like Douglas Murray absolutely crucify Dave Smith is a real treat. And Con Tomlinson, Dave Smith is ignorant, Douglas Murray crushed him. And the only reason I read those three out is it shows me that on social media in particular, when these kind of events happen, and I call them events because everybody watches them, when they do happen, there's very little middle ground. There are very little people who pop up on social media and go, you know what, on the one hand, I thought Dave made some good points. On the other, Douglas made some good points, and I really enjoyed the experience, which is probably what Joe Rogan thought. But no, we're in a very tribal world where before you guys even sat down together with Joe Rogan, they'd already decided you were going to be disintegrated, dismantled, and crucified. And similarly, a lot of people who like you and don't like Douglas Murray felt exactly the same way about what was going to happen to him. What does that tell you about discourse today, and what do we do about that, if anything?
Before the answer, I just want to point out, though, that it's not just about tribalism in this case. Like, yeah, there are people who are going to be Dave Smith fans are going to side with him no matter what. And there's people who are going to be Douglas Murray fans that are just going to side with him no matter what. Even in my own comment section, I got people who, you know, who sided with Dave Smith. And I got people that were like, oh, Douglas Murray completely owned him. Dave Smith is a joke. You know, I got people from both sides. So yes, it can be tribalistic, but listen, I didn't even watch the debates. I just saw that segment because that's what everybody was talking about. So I watched that segment, and listen, I don't know who Douglas Murray is. And when it comes to Dave Smith, I like Dave Smith overall, but I don't agree with everything he says. There's sometimes he's had some bad takes. Even when it comes to this whole Palestine and, you know, arguing up the whole Israel and Palestine war, I don't even fully agree with him. But just on the principle that once you have to start insulting people's expertise and just resorting to, well, why are you even talking about this? Have you ever even been there? Are you a scholar? Are you an expert? Once you have to resort to those, in my opinion, you lost.
Well, for the record, I will say, I mean, and I try to not live my life in on internet comments, but for this one, I just could not help myself. But if you look at the YouTube comments or the Spotify comments, I mean, it's overwhelmingly hostile toward Douglas. It seems to me that there's, every account on Twitter with an Israeli flag and a Hebrew name in their bio certainly seem to think that I got my ass kicked. What's even more fascinating is that there'd be specific moments that people draw 180 degree opposite conclusions from. Like the one that I saw going super viral is him, you know, asking me if I've ever been to Israel, and then kind of putting on a performance about how shocked he is that I haven't been there. And it was interesting to me how different people could look at the exact same moment, and one group of people could say, oh, this was Dave getting destroyed. And the other group of people could say, I mean, like, objectively, this is a non-argument. This doesn't win you any points in a debate. Like, I obviously fall into the second group there, but it certainly does show you how dug in certain people are, of course, which I think is to be expected in this most of contentious issues. But yeah, I don't know exactly what to take from that, but much like in the last 5 years particularly, it does feel like people are living in different realities. And even if you were to ask people to tell the story of COVID, I mean, like, what just happened over the last 5 years with this global pandemic? It's amazing how much people could have completely diametrically opposed understandings of the reality we just lived through. Now, I'm not being a relativist here. I think one of those sides is wrong and the other one is right, but that is where we are.
Scott Adams actually talks about that in his book, Win Bigly. I believe that's where he talked about it. But Win Bigly, he talked about that whole thing about how, yes, there seems to be people who, like, nowadays people are just kind of living in two different realities. And it's the same way as two people could go watch the same movie, the exact same movie, and come away with different opinions about it. By the way, I know Scott Adams isn't really talked about, like, that highly anymore at all. Like, ever since his segregation advocation, I guess I would put it. But Scott Adams, if you haven't read any of his books are really good. I highly recommend reading Scott Adams's books.
Funny enough, I would say the COVID debate is a lot more nuanced in reality than the two extremities take it, for what it's worth. But let's bring in John Spencer, because he certainly was not in the Dave Smith one camp. You tweeted, Dave Smith and Douglas Murray debated who qualifies as an expert and who should be making declarative statements about certain wars. That question answers itself. And that's been construed, John, to mean that you believe that Dave Smith was not the expert in the room. Explain why you felt that Dave Smith lost this debate.
Sure. I wouldn't say it had anything to do with Douglas. I would have to say it was the statements that Dave Smith made during the podcast, which highlight, and I won't get into the credentialism as Dave's quoting four-star generals or who's an expert, who's not. I do research. I think Dave tells jokes for a living. I had problems with the statements he were made, and then how do you come to that conclusion, which really does get to the podcaster world versus other.
Oof, this dude. This sounds like another pish posha, if you will. Oh, you make jokes for a living. I actually do research. Oh, pish posh.
On how did you come to that opinion or that declarative statement, like Israel is intentionally killing civilians? I mean, there's like 10 different ways you can do research. You can do comparative, case study. And I think this is what Douglas was saying. If you haven't been there, then how are you getting to your conclusion? You ethnographic, you can go there and do interviews in Gaza, like both Douglas and I have done with soldiers. What's going on? How are you doing it? You can do even historical archival data research. That's not what it appears that Dave does, and it seems to be more of a historical revisionism. Take a piece of data that you got and then tell a really convincing narrative on how you got to your conclusion. But as somebody who has students, I mean, correlation is not causation is that famous phrase, when that story is actually just a lot of correlation and inferences. How did you get to your conclusion? How do you do that research? Forget the expertise and the credentialism. You're making a statement like it's true, and I know Dave's anti-war, and that's great, but you can't be anti-factual, and Dave, without Douglas, just made a bunch of not true statements.
Now, I may be about to shock you with.
Man, Piers, is it just me or does Piers shill a lot more on this? But see, that's a whole, what that guy just said, it's like a whole different argument than, like, well, you're not an expert and therefore, like, if Dave is saying a bunch of things that aren't true, well, then rebuttal, like, give a rebuttal to him then on his arguments. That's what you do. You don't just start going, oh, have you done the research? Are you a scholar? Have you been on the field like me? I have actually talked to people. Like, great. If you've talked to people and you know more about Dave on this subject, then say the facts. Give the facts. Conservatives in general, when they're arguing with like indoctrinated lefties or liberals, when they're doing change my mind things, they don't just sit there and be like, do you know what you're talking about? I have actually know what I'm talking about because I have been to these things, but you don't know what you're talking about. Like, you don't say that. You bring up the facts and you correct them, like, and you give a rebuttal to them. That's how you change minds. You don't just sit there and be like, oh, you're not a scholar like me.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think the overwhelm, which is what me and Dave were talking over X, is that Israel is intentionally killing civilians, especially children. That's not a factual statement at all, because it doesn't even include the base information. So it's almost like, you just don't know the information you need to know to make that judgment. And, let's forget comparing it to a domestic situation like Dave continues to do on Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, others. Like, if somebody killed my kids and I know where he's at and I go to that apartment building and I kill everybody in it, that's murder. And that's what Israel is doing. And that's not true. Even you, Piers, have commented about Israel striking something and saying, look at the number of civilians, that's not acceptable. That's not how war works. It's not even how you would assess that situation, because it completely rules out what the law of war says about proportionality, about assessing what is the target, who is that individual, what's his value, concrete value, and then, which a lot of people leave out, is what precautions did Israel take, like we just saw recently, of calling everybody in the building saying, look, the terrorist is using this building for a military purpose. You must leave. You must get out of this area, or all the other steps, these civilian harm mitigation measures. So that one's a really huge one, but there are other ones, like when Dave said that there are more children that have died in this war than any modern war. That's just, of course, Douglas called that out, but there is a whole list of them, from the blockade, from the occupation, like all of these things were just counterfactual and not a logic that leads to a conclusion, but he's really convincing, and that's what I have a problem with.
See, like, that was a good argument. I actually agree with him, because I think a lot of people who are chiming in on this, like Dave Smith and, like people who always harp on about, oh, my babies and children, my Palestinian babies and children, I feel like they're being manipulated by the propaganda. It's the same thing like when liberals go like, oh my God, don't deport my criminals, but my non-citizens, they're not gang members. Keep them around. This is harmful. Like, they fall into the propaganda as well. And that's what I see on the right-wing side too, when it comes to right-wingers, or well, not right-wingers necessarily, because I mean, Dave Smith's like a libertarian, but people that are just not on the left, they fall into this too, when they're like, but no, my Palestine, my Israel. And that's why I say, like, I don't even fully agree with Dave Smith on these things, but I do agree that in that particular spot right there, he won the argument.
All right, Dave, your response.
Sure. Well, okay. I mean, I do think that, like, you do a lot of this, as Douglas did, a lot of this poisoning of the well stuff, and saying you tell jokes and I do research, and you could say this isn't credentialism all you want to, but it's really a lot before you start taking on an actual argument. In fact, it wasn't until the follow-up question that you pointed anything out. So to the analogy that I'm making, and as you were quoting me on Twitter the other day, I'm not saying that I'm not familiar, although I'm not claiming to have your level of expertise with international humanitarian law, or you can assert that war works a different way. I'm talking about something much more fundamental. What I'm saying is that Douglas is making the claim, and many others are, that Israel's killing of civilians is unintentional. And I'm talking about a very basic philosophical concept of morality, of intentionality, and that by what people mean when they say intentional, that if this was done domestically, we would consider it intentional. The point is that war, yes, look, there's been the Geneva Convention, there's international humanitarian law. It goes back to the mid-19th century, was codified into law after World War II. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a step in the right direction. But this is all a politician or a group of politicians declaring a word, and the fact that there are lines drawn on a map does not in any way magically transform morality or the basic philosophical concept of intent. And even in your example there, if I were to give out pamphlets, give out a warning, tell everybody I'd really like you to leave, and then they didn't, and I blew up a building, we would consider that intentional murder. Now, my point, I think a lot of times people object to almost what the implications of this way of looking at the world might be, but forget all of that for a second. I'm just talking about how human beings think about these things. And when you talk about an intentional killing, now, by the way, I should also stipulate that it's not as if that's the case in every single one of these strikes that Israel's taken. And we've gotten all types of evidence about this. And there's quite a number of cases, hundreds of cases, where they're waiting for terrorists to go back into a residential building and then attacking the building, suspected terrorists, I should say. But regardless, none of this is even really the point. The point is that on a very basic human level, and I would also think this is completely incompatible with Christianity, although I'm not trying to lecture anybody about that, but there is no micro and macro morality. There is no micro and macro intentionality. These are human concepts. And if you are dropping a bomb and you know that there are women and children on the receiving end of that bomb, then that was done intentionally. And I think this is the reality of war. And I think if we're going to have a conversation about this, we should deal with it in reality.
Yeah, and also, John, I'll get you to respond.
See, I don't know if Dave Smith is like factoring in the whole, like, Hamas kind of hides behind the women and children thing. Like, they kind of hide behind their own citizens in order to for situations like this. they'll hide behind them, and then when Israel attacks, they could be like, "Oh my God, look, they killed all women and children." And then Dave Smith goes on here and goes, "Oh my God, this is horrible. Oh my God, evil Israel." Like I don't know if Dave Smith has factored that into it. And also too, I mean, you have Israel at least warning these people, "Hey, listen, there's going to be a strike. Get out of there." I mean, at the end of the day, if they don't get out of there, I'm not saying, oh my, they deserved it or anything like that. I'm not saying that. But it's like, what? I don't know. What is this Israel exactly? Like, what do they want? How do they want this war to go down? Like, if they just want the war to end, yeah, I agree. Like, I don't want needless deaths. But it takes two parties to stop the war. It takes two sides to come together and stop the war and bring peace. And honestly, I think even if Israel were to just stand down right now and be like, okay, we're ending this, we're going to cease fire. Do you honestly think Hamas is going to like stop? Even if it stopped for a short while, how much longer until they start it up again? And I don't know, these these people that are going on there, it's like, and these like Dave Smiths and all these other people that are like spurging out about this stuff. It's like, I don't know. What do you ideally like? What do you exactly how you want this to be handled?
But I mean, it just seems to me, having done so many debates about this since October the 7th, I've never disputed that Israel had a right to defend itself. In fact, a duty to defend itself and its people from any further attacks of that magnitude, given how horrific it was. So let me just restate that again. But there's a kind of unique battlefield in Gaza. I would argue, and maybe you would argue differently, that you've got 2 million people, 50% of whom are under 18, and that the enemy are all living in civilian areas amongst the civilians. So you have a kind of horrific battleground, if you like, to attack if you're Israel, in the sense that you can only constantly kill a lot of civilians, including children, if you go after the enemy in those civilian areas. And that's exactly what's happened. And I can't think of a similar war, and maybe you can, you're more experienced at this, I accept, than I am, but can you think of another scenario where the proportion of children that is in the attack zone has been at 50% or higher, and therefore we're seeing so many children being killed?
So look, yeah, that's the case study or comparative model that you could do the research on. How does this compare to anything else? And it doesn't, right? The 20 years of preparing Gaza for war, the 400 miles of tunnels, the human sacrifice strategy, because both sides actually have legal obligations. And when Hamas says, I need the death of my women and children, that's not right. So the data about what is the population. So one, I don't want to be, heartless about it. And every death of a child is terrible, but you're evaluating anybody who's below the 18 as a child, as in, that Hamas has basically children. I joined the military at 17. Am I a child? And Hamas deploys. The average age of a Hamas recruit right now is 16 and a half. We've seen them put weapons in hands of very young children. You have combatant and you have non-combatant. Is there any comparable status to the demographic of Gaza? No. Is there any comparison to where another country, Egypt, refuses to let even those that want out from the combat areas, and Israel, who took weeks to evacuate the civilians from the areas they're going into? So absolutely, there are so many here, but back to Dave's comment, which it stands on itself, explaining what he doesn't know about war or the laws of war, about them being codified and when they went into effect, or this is a simple question of morality that, war should be no killing of civilians. That should just be it. You two military should go find your place to fight and just have it out. That's not the history of war from the creation, literally, of city-states going out and everything.
Again, I think
you want to get into the frameworks to judge. No, the frameworks to judge war. We as societies, all the societies of war, the Geneva Conventions is one example, have decided here are the boundaries of brutality of war. Like, we don't bomb innocent civilians. And you cannot say, I don't care what your Haaretz articles say, you're not going to show me that Israel has targeted civilians, intentionally killing civilians, when I can show you measures that Israel has taken that no military in the history of war have taken to get civilians out of harm's way so they can target that terrorist. You once said on a podcast, if the terrorist is holding a baby and shooting at you, then of course you can kill the terrorist. And unfortunately, what they're doing is wrong. But then I understand that when we have cases of Hamas doing that, holding children so nobody will shoot at them, or going underneath a hospital, a school, a mosque, doing what we call lawfare, you have to have an understanding of the evolutions of the law of war, how it is adjudicated. When you say evidence, I mean evidence, not TikTok videos. I mean actual evidence of what did the person dropping the commander know? What did he do to prevent it? What time did he do it? What type of munition did he use? Dave's statement stand on his own of showing that he doesn't know the foundations of war, even if it's what you call a just war or just execution of the war. You're just not communicating that you know enough to make a statement like that. I'm just philosophically talking about killing civilians is wrong. That's what the law of war says. It says don't target civilians. Yeah. What Hamas did on October 7th. It doesn't say 0 civilians will die in a war. There's a precaution law of war. There is the feasible things you do to prevent the civilian death. But you can't say Israel hasn't done that. And I'm saying, based on my research, not an appeal to expertise, going there, interviewing IDF soldiers, commanders, Netanyahu himself, I'm saying Israel is not targeting or intentionally trying to kill civilians. They're doing the opposite more than anybody else.
More shilling, more ads. But I mean, yeah. What's this dude's name? I might as well just look up what this dude's name is. Joining Professor John Spencer. Professor John Spencer. John Spencer. So yes, John Spencer, I think, was absolutely correct there. And see, this is the type of arguments that are needed in these debates. You know, like these are the type of appeal to expertise or being condescending to Dave Smith because, you know, or not being condescending to the other side and telling them like, oh, you don't really know anything. You're just a podcaster. You're just a comedian. These type of arguments is what's needed.
Okay.
Again, I mean, Dave, that last point, that last point John made, and obviously respond to everything he said, but the last point about he's been there, you know, one of Douglas Murray's attack lines with you was that unlike him, who regularly goes to Israel, he regularly goes to Ukraine, you don't go to these places that you then opine on. You know, personally, I don't think you need to go to the sun to know it's hot. But you know, a lot of people agree with Douglas Murray and say, yeah, you know, actually he's right. If you don't actually go, how can you really know what you're talking about? And John's kind of inferring that as well. What do you say to that?
No, Piers, I'm not inferring that you have to go there. I'm saying what research methodology are you using? If you're not doing interviews of people involved in the actions, if you're not collecting data in a certain way, which you can get from going there, you can do ethnographic research by interviewing the people involved in the execution. I'm not saying that straw man of, well, Dave's not been there, so he can't talk. If Dave did research, then absolutely. If Dave didn't have giant logical holes in what he's saying, like about the blockade or about the bombing or things like this, then you don't have to go there. There are many ways to do research. I'm saying Dave doesn't do that.
Okay, so I'll say Piers, it's both. I feel like both in this debate and in the debate with Douglas Murray, it almost kind of feels like the analogy I'd use is like if two fighters agreed to fight. You know, two guys in the UFC, they agree to fight, and so they show up under the lights, and you get into the cage, and I put my hands up, and then the other guy puts his hands down and starts telling me what a better fighter he is than me. And you're like, okay, well then let's do it. Like, I don't know, let's have the conversation. Like, instead of all this time just telling me you're an expert. Hold on, wait 1 second. Let me finish my point since you had some time to talk there. Look, all of this stuff about like whether you have to be there. By the way, it's going viral online, but there's this great clip of Douglas Murray taking apart the lived experience argument from the left and making all these points about how people who were never in the Holocaust have written much more beautifully and accurate about the Holocaust than people who actually went through it themselves. if you want to say that you gain some, if you want to say you have expertise, or you want to say going there gives you some more expertise, then sure. I mean, I wouldn't argue that. No one's arguing that you can't learn about a place from going there. But again, this is the fighter putting his hands down and going, I've trained so much harder than you. I'm such a better boxer than you. You could never hang with me. It's like, okay, so let's get it going. Anyway, in terms of, by the way, there is absolutely no chance, and I haven't examined Douglas Murray's passport, but there's no chance that he's not a hypocrite on this issue. I guarantee he has not been to all of the places that he's commented on. I don't know. He's commented on every foreign country and what's going on geopolitically for 20 years. I'm sure he hasn't visited all of those places. Back to the point, because it seems like in these things we do everything except actually debate the issue. You missed my entire point. Once you're appealing to the law or appealing to how warfare actually works, you're missing the entire point that I was making. My point is that this is not how the law works, and this is not how war actually works. I'm making a much more basic human point, a fundamental point. Look, Piers, the other day, okay, this is, and by the way, if you don't want to believe this story, it's fine. It's just one firsthand account from Gaza. But whether it's true or not, and there's no reason to suspect it's not true, but whether it's true or not, there's just been hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of examples like this. But so there was a woman, a building collapsed. She says, as she's walking down the building, she can hear the little kids, not 16-year-old members of Hamas. You're talking 4- and 5-year-olds screaming for their mothers while they're buried underneath the rubble, screaming for help from their mommy. And you know what, Pierce? No help is coming because there's no bulldozers in Gaza. Nobody's coming to get those kids out. This is the reality of war. And this is what I'm trying, this is the main point that I was trying to make to Douglas Murray, which he kept running away from. If you're going to say that our goal here is to degrade Hamas, Murray conceded you probably can't eliminate them, but he feels like you can degrade them. If you're going to degrade Hamas and the cost of it is those little children dying under rubble, screaming for their mother as their bones are crushed and no one's coming to help them, then fine. But at least say that you find that price acceptable. And then we could have a real conversation about why people are going to view you as a monster and why the other side will never stop fighting and will always be against you. Because I could tell you for sure, if that was my kids, and I know, Pierce, if those were your kids as well, you wouldn't want to hear anything about how, well, we've codified in international law that this is the norm of the way wars are allowed to be fought versus not allowed to be fought. I'm making a very human point that this is the reality of war. And you can say under international humanitarian law, it's not considered intentional. We would consider this an intentional act in any other area. That's the point. It's a very basic human point that if anyone were to do this domestically and then tried to use the defense of like, no, but I dropped a leaflet. No, I didn't really want to kill them. I just wanted to kill them. We'd go, I don't care. You blew up a building knowing there were kids in there. That's the essence of this whole thing. And there's no amount, like there's no amount of expertise that can really get you away from this basic fundamental moral logic.
So this is what I'm talking about. Like, it's all appeal to emotion. Like, it's what the lefties do. It's all appeal to emotion, and that's how they got brainwashed into and indoctrinated into a lot of the way they're thinking is because of the appeal to emotion. It's not really logical. It's just all about the emotion, and Dave Smith is appealing to emotion. But what about the crying kids? Yeah, obviously, anyone with a heart and a soul and any amount of empathy would say that is horrific. But if he wants to play the father card, listen, I'm a father as well. And if I were living in a building and in the middle of a war zone and there was leaflets that came by saying, hey, listen, you might want to be out of here by this time or else we're going to bomb it. Yeah, you better believe as a father of children, I'm going to be getting my family the hell out of there because obviously I don't want my children to die. So yes, I would be doing whatever I could, getting my family far the hell away from there as I possibly can. And again, like, you're taking away any responsibility from Hamas. John Spencer just said that Hamas hides behind children. They hide behind them. Is there no responsibility on their end? They're not doing anything. Dave Smith himself said, underneath the rubble, all those children, they were screaming, right? And there's no one coming to help them. Why isn't Hamas coming to help them? What are they doing for their own people? They're not about protecting their own people. They're all about taking out Israel. That's their whole goal. It has consumed them. And so they have no concern about their citizens. It's get rid of Israel by any means necessary. And they only see their citizens as tools to be indoctrinated into in their ongoing nonstop war against Israel.
Piers,
okay, but Dave, let me ask you a difficult. Hang on, John. I will come to you. I just wanted to ask you, like, let's go back to the end of World War II and the dropping of 2 atomic bombs in Japan, which obviously caused huge loss of life. And I imagine by your criteria, that was a deliberate targeting of civilians. The argument in favor of doing it was that it brought an end to World War II and potentially saved millions more lives from being taken. In other words, there's your moral argument right there, is that you do this to stop this. You take this number of lives to stop many more lives being killed. I mean, when you look at that, for example, what's your view of that moral debate?
So, okay, well, first of all, just on the specifics, and we have talked about this before, but I tend to agree with 5-star General Dwight D. Eisenhower that it was unnecessary and wrong for us to drop the nuclear weapons. But regardless of that, even if 5-star General Eisenhower is wrong about that, and the other generals who supported it were right, this is exactly the point, Piers, is that when you start to think about war for what it actually is, what the overwhelming onus becomes clear. And the onus is on you to demonstrate that we absolutely have to do this. That the standard for war, when you're talking about intentionally killing innocent civilians, the standard ought to be, the burden should always be on you to demonstrate that we absolutely have to do this. I know this is horrible. I know what the result of this is, but that we have to do this because so much more human suffering would come from us not doing this. And this is, to me, the essence of the point of why I talk about war in this way, is that because if you don't think about it this way, it ends up being very easy to find other justifications, justifications like Hamas must go. Hamas must go. It's like, whoa, hold on, wait a second. I kind of think Hamas must go. I kind of think the Likud party must go. I definitely think Kim Jong-un must go. I kind of think Vladimir Putin must go. But that's not the standard for whether or not we're justified to just start slaughtering innocent people in the hope of achieving that end. What the standard ought to be is simply, do you absolutely have to do this, or there will be more human suffering? That should be the standard. And in the case of Israel-Gaza, I think that entirely changes the scope of things, because look, as all of us know, right? Gaza was, before October 7th, the most surveilled area in the world. Israel is the fortress of the world. It was a monumental failure of both policy and security for October 7th to have happened in the first place. And it's just not the case that there's gonna be October 7th after October 7th if Israel just stops now and leaves Gaza in the rubble mess that it is. And so that's exactly, like, I'm not I get your point, Piers, because you're almost going, wait, but if we follow this logic, then when could we ever fight a war? And essentially my point is that, yeah, the onus should be on anybody who wants to fight a war, ever. The onus should be on them to demonstrate that it is absolutely necessary and that there's nothing else we could do in this situation.
Okay, John, your response.
Piers, two UFC fighters enter a ring and one punches the other in the nose, and Dave says, how dare he punches him in the nose in this fight? That's the analogy. He's not making an appeal to facts, how the law of war works, how war works, whether it's the theory underneath the war or the actual framework to understand it. He doesn't like theory like just war theory, things like that, but the framework that is there. Now, he just said that one side has to show that there is a military necessity, he doesn't know these words, but that's what he's talking about, to actually enter the war. Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th.
I've never heard military necessity before. You blew my mind with your expertise.
Right, yes. I know. It's like you need, I'll give you War 101 offline. That's fine. Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th. Israel invoked Article 51, a self-defense war in accordance with the United Nations, again, more frameworks that people need to know, and said Hamas will be destroyed, removed from political power, and the hostages returned. Now, David said that's not necessary, and that all Israel needs to do is put more men on the wall. That's what Dave said his solution, because he also doesn't study military theory on how do you win a war. He intermixes counterinsurgency theory with a war against removing a regime from power, defeating their military.
That's not.
This is
that's
what
not
Dave
what I
isn't
was
making
doing.
factual. You said that was exact words on Lex Freeman.
No.
He's not making an appeal to facts. I'm debating. He's making an appeal to emotion and morals, not what the law.
Morals. I'm making an appeal to logic and morals.
Hamas started a war on October.
Maybe morals. I'm not so sure about logic, though.
Hamas is going to lose a war, and it's going to never be in power again. It's never. And Hamas is the one that says they want to do October 7th. But Dave said, just put the wall up. They won't be able to do it on October 7th ever again, right? You have this blockade, although there was 100 tunnels going from Egypt to Gaza to build this military that Hamas built. And he'll say that Netanyahu sent him money. He's not making an appeal to facts. This is what we have a problem with Dave Smith. He makes an appeal to emotion and does historical revisionism. And he tells these narratives that aren't true.
Piers,
so his
can I just tell you, Piers?
Fails. He's anti-war.
What's so funny about this, Piers? Okay, what's so funny about this, Piers, is that after all of this, once again, all of this, I'm an expert, you don't know this, I'm an expert, you haven't studied military 101. Then after all of that, the substance of what we're left with is, right, okay, got it. After all of that, the substance that we're left with is Hamas started the war on October 7th. Yes, the most basic point that every pro-Israel person has made on this show forever. That's what you've got here. Okay.
I got a fact.
It's
now
not
you want to
a
debate
fact.
the facts
It's not
on
a
how
fact.
Israel
Israel's
could
been
achieve that goal.
By the way, you also don't even know what an appeal. It's not an appeal to emotion, by the way. That's not what it is. Although you do seem to be flirting with an appeal to authority. No, it's an appeal to morality. For me to describe the actual human impact of what this policy is resulting in is not an appeal to emotion. I mean, it's an appeal to morality, and it's an appeal to logic. An appeal to logic. Look, you can't answer me this very simple question, okay? Here's the very simple question, okay? You'd have to admit, look, let's take the worst example, just not your example where there's a Hamas rocket firing at Israel.
Give me Gaza. Don't give me a hypothetical and the morals of the law of war. Give me an actual question.
If you interrupted me, I was on my way to. Let's say Israel targets an area where there are 2 combatants and 2 civilians. It's your 1-to-1 ratio, okay? And they decide that's acceptable by the international laws of war or whatever. By the way, in your appeal to the international laws, you didn't mention the ICC warrant for Netanyahu, which they don't seem to be respecting that much. But anyway, but we're still, you can still appeal to this framework even though they never have to live up to it. But let's just say, okay, the exact same action happened domestically. If someone were to do that, you would call it intentional murder, right? How does the concept of intentionality change because a politician uttered the word war, they declared it, and it's taking place in a foreign country? Without appealing to authority or appealing to law or appealing to what war normally is, can you as a human being explain to me how the concept of intentional changes magically because a politician uttered the phrase war?
Well, the thing about the politician, it's the framework. So yes, I can give you, and this is literally you're explaining in the question how you don't know how the framework of a war works. And
so teach me. Stop telling me I don't know. Stop telling me I don't know and demonstrate it. Teach me
I didn't say you don't know. Your question, I'll teach you something. Your domestic law has a complete societal agreement on what those laws will be adjudicated and how they'll be determined.
No, it doesn't.
How a criminal deterrence, absolutely, American law.
Lots of people don't agree to the law.
If you kill somebody, then you'll be convicted of a crime based on a jury and a judge, all this. Then you want to apply that on war, but then disregard what the laws of war, the things that all nations have agreed to on. This is how we account for intentionality.
You can't do it without making an appeal to the law. You can't do it. You can't explain it to me logically.
The body of laws have accounted for how do you get over that intentionality thing. if you use the same thing, which is when somebody says there's a war crime, or when you say Israel has intentionally targeted a civilian because, look, there's if you have to go to the statistical thing, we have issues unless you're doing comparative analysis. But if there's one combatant and one civilian, you don't know that, okay, what is that combatant? Is he a commander? Is he the commander? Is he a regular soldier? That accounts for what is the excessive collateral damage, and that's where intentionality gets into it. But, oh, by the way, what have you done to prevent it? In the domestic situation, you'd send the police to go get that criminal and then try them. In war, if you're a member of the other military in which I'm at war against, I don't have to have an excuse. I can kill you on sight.
Yeah, no,
okay,
I know,
very quickly,
again,
before I let you...
I don't think Dave's understanding, like what he's trying to say is why he keeps bringing up the law. It's perfect with his fighter analogy he brought up earlier. It would be like if you had two fighters in the ring, one guy punches each other in the nose and Dave's like, man, that's not morally right. Don't you think it's morally wrong to punch him in the nose? It's like, yeah, but they're in the middle of a UFC. They're in the middle of an MMA fight. That's legal to do in there. That's the whole point of it is that you're going to be, is that, you beat each other up. And he keeps like trying to appeal to a morality. And again, yeah, no one is saying, yes, it's okay that children are dying. That's fine. That's not the thing. It's the same way the lefty will use the lefty arguments. They'll say like, do you think it's morally right that we're sending people back to their country? Or Spencer's correct that Dave Smith, and I said this earlier too, it's Dave Smith, it's all appealing to emotion. And it's because of the rhetoric from the Hamas side, the pro-Palestine side. They have good rhetoric, and that rhetoric has gotten to people like Dave Smith and stuff.
Hang on, Dave.
Yes, there are logistical differences. Sure.
Hang on, Dave. Hang on, Dave. Dave's going to stay with me when Eric wants. Hang on, guys. Hang on. John, we're going to let you go, John. Before we let you go, I want to ask you just one thing that also came out of the debate with Douglas and Dave, which was this issue of whether people who have what most people believe to be bad faith, deliberate conspiracy theory nonsense views. For example, Darryl Cooper saying Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War, whether people like Darryl Cooper should be platformed on gigantic podcasts like Joe Rogan or not, particularly if they're not going to be really vigorously challenged on what is something that to me is such an obviously untrue and offensive premise. What's your quick view of that?
I think that we should not platform historical revisionists who go back in time and find a fact and then tell it in a certain way to spin the narrative of what we should know about events. If you want to look at Darryl Cooper, look at the list of deleted tweets from Darryl Cooper. I'm against intellectually, again, no expertise involved. Anybody can research whatever they want. And if they come out with a new finding, that's great, using evidence, using data, using a research methodology. But no, you don't get to be a historical revisionist like Dave.
Actually, I do.
Okay, John Spencer, thank you very much indeed. Well, Dave, I'm going to let you respond, but with Eric. So I'm going to say goodbye to John. John, sure. Thank you. It was a riveting debate between you two. I really appreciate it. Well, joining us now with some final thoughts on the debate, a man who can claim to be friends with Joe Rogan, with Dave Smith.
Yeah, I think we all know Dave's going to pretty much disagree with that. If you want to watch the full thing below, it's in the description. But that's where that guy lost me. Where John Spencer and Douglas Murray lose people is that you shouldn't be sitting there saying they don't have the right to say this stuff. That's the kind of stuff that leads to like the, C-19 censorship or the election censorship when people were thinking that that there were shenanigans in the election. That's what leads to that type of stuff. So no, I don't agree with John Spencer that Dave Smith shouldn't be able to go on Joe Rogan and give his beliefs on the whole Palestine and Israel thing. I think it's important to have conversations like this, though. So if John Spencer knows better, then I think it's important that he be allowed to go on there and debate Dave Smith on these topics. Not just not allow Dave Smith to talk about this stuff. That's not how things are done. So listen, I completely agree with John Smith, and I actually think he cooked Dave Smith here. I think Dave Smith revealed himself to just be appealing on nothing but emotions. Because he's fallen for all the Hamas and the pro-Palestine rhetoric, And John Spencer, I think, did a good job of bringing up facts, explaining what's really going on over there, bringing up how the law of war works and such. And I agree with John Spencer on that. Where I don't agree with him is I don't think we should just decide who's allowed to talk about things or not on podcasts. It's just ridiculous. It's actually better to have these discussions on there, and instead of just being like, oh, well, Dave Smith, you don't really know what you're talking about, and therefore. But what did you guys think about this? Do you agree with my assessment? Do you agree with Dave Smith? Or do you agree with John Spencer? Sound off in the comment section below. Like this video if you liked it, and if you really liked it, please consider subscribing to my channel. It'll really help me out a lot, and I'll really appreciate it. If you like seeing Dave Smith, if you like Dave Smith stuff, I got content on the screen that I think you'll like. And if you like Piers Morgan panels, I got Piers Morgan playlists that I think you'll like, and a whole bunch more content just like this that I think you'll enjoy.